Hey everyone, I'm Chris. I serve as the lead pastor of Mill Creek Foursquare, and welcome to our podcast. This exists as an extension of the teaching ministry of our pastoral team. Here you're going to be able to find everything from Sunday messages to midweek communications, classes, interviews, conversations with friends. So we hope that you feel invited to participate in the life of our fellowship and receive of this ministry. Here you're going to be able to learn more about current events and much about the scriptures. So enjoy, relax, breathe, and ultimately may you be experiencing the presence of God. Our goal is to make disciples of Jesus who are experiencing his life, engaging in his presence, extending the gospel to their family, neighborhood, workplace, and world. So welcome and enjoy.
Welcome to episode number 9 in our midweek podcast. The goal of this episode is to reevaluate the idea of the rapture, specifically with attention to some of the texts or passages in the New Testament that are most commonly appealed to as seemingly in support of this idea of a rapture taking place or being an important feature of Christian teaching and expectation. I'm John. I'm here with Pastor Trevor.
What's going on?
And this is the second in our sort of 3-part mini-series within this larger podcast on the concept of the rapture. In our previous week, last week's episode, what we did was introduce the concept of the rapture. We sort of defined what the idea itself is, and then we spent some time talking about the origins of this idea, the popularizing of this idea, specifically within, especially within North American culture in relatively recent history.
And Nicolas Cage, of course.
And Nicolas Cage. And and we talked a little bit about the appeal, on the one hand, of this doctrine or this idea, this theological idea. But we also called into question, despite its understandable appeal, this idea that believers can hope in some kind of escape from trial or tribulation at the end of days. Despite that appeal, we tried to emphasize that the very concept seems to run counter to so much of what the teaching and the theology of the New Testament really is. And so the goal in this episode is to press a little bit more deeply into our what you could call our critique of this rapture idea, because it should be fairly clear by now that we're going to try to suggest that this is not the most helpful way of reading the book of Revelation or the New Testament as a whole, imagining that this rapture thing is going to happen or is a valid sort of feature of our theology. And so in this episode, we're going to look at a few biblical texts more broadly in the New Testament that tend to be looked at as or assumed to be sort of teaching about the rapture. And then we'll spend a little bit of time looking at the book of Revelation itself and how that factors into the conversation.
Yeah, this is the episode where we actually unpack so people don't think we're a bunch of heretics.
Sure.
Said in a very mild-mannered way. I mean, the basic question we're getting at today, right? Is there any passage in the entire New Testament that speaks of the rapture? I mean, that really is the essential question that we're asking and examining through this episode. Now, we just want to dive right in because I know we have a lot of exegetical, kind of theological work to do to get to work here. Now, John, one of the most well-known texts about the rapture, or supposed to be around the rapture or about the rapture, is 1 Thessalonians 4, right? A New Testament epistle, a letter from Paul. Can you walk us through just in 1 Thessalonians 4? I mean, it's the picture of getting caught up in the air. If someone's probably heard that, I would imagine that maybe people off the top of their head don't know the exact reference, but the idea of being caught in the air, they've heard something about that or a broader idea, especially they've been exposed to kind of a rapture theological system of sorts. So can you walk us through really that text? What's the general picture of that text.
Yeah. Yeah, this is certainly one of the texts, if not the text, that is most commonly appealed to within the New Testament as something that seems to many people to be very clearly, very obviously, very explicitly teaching about a rapture. This idea that when the Lord returns, believers will be caught up in the air. And depending on how one frames it, often the assumption is that somehow this is this sort of classic picture of, escaping or leaving behind this life or one's earthly body or something, and sort of going off into some kind of disembodied heavenly existence in the clouds. That those are some of the popular ideas that are often associated with the future hope of Christianity and of the New Testament. And this is a classic text that seems to envisage something like that. Specifically with this idea of being sort of caught up in the air or snatched away or these kinds of things. The word rapture doesn't actually appear in any of our English Bibles. At least no translation that I'm aware of uses the English term rapture unless it's perhaps in a heading somewhere. But the Greek verb for this idea of being sort of caught up is harpazo. And the Latin translation of that verb is rapio in the Latin Vulgate, a sort of early version of the Bible in Latin. And so that's where we get the sort of English term rapture from, and so that's why this text tends to be associated in the minds of many people with this concept. The important thing to recognize about 1 Thessalonians 4, like any biblical text, is that, if my framework for understanding the book, or if my framework for understanding the passage is simply my own experience, my own assumptions, my own sort of conceptual world, then I might read all kinds of ideas into the text. And certainly if I have already committed myself to this idea of a rapture for some other reason or on some other grounds, if I have been shaped by the Left Behind films or novels, if I have been shaped by a sort of popular assumption that the whole point of the Christian life is sort of escaping this world for the sake of sort of heavenly reward as an individual, if those kinds of things are already shaping my approach, then on the face of it, this text does seem to teach fairly clearly that kind of idea, right? The text, Paul is talking to people in the Thessalonian church saying, we don't want you to be uninformed about those who have died so that you may not grieve as those who have no hope. He goes on to talk about Jesus' own death and resurrection, but also the comfort and assurance that believers can have that those who have died in Christ will share in the resurrection as well. And there's this imagery that Paul then introduces his audience to of the Lord returning, and there's a cry of command, there's an archangel's call, there's the sound of God's trumpet, the Lord descending from heaven, and then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up in the clouds together with them to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will be with the Lord forever. And so on the face of it, certainly, there again, just as we've talked in the podcast about there being an understandable appeal to the concept of the rapture, certainly we want to acknowledge that there's an understandable sort of, on the face of it.
I'm snatched up, I'm caught up.
Yeah. I don't see why not. I don't see why this text wouldn't sort of immediately suggest, that seems to be the picture. However, what's crucial to recognize in any sort of responsible or wise reading of the biblical text, as we've talked about in the podcast before, is taking seriously the context in which these documents were produced, the frames of reference that the authors and audiences would have been working with and very often just taking for granted, and how the more that we can understand these texts, these words, these images, this language within its own context and frame of reference, the more likely we will be able to get a sort of accurate picture of what's going on, rather than reading ideas into the text that might actually be quite foreign to it.
Yeah, context is key.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, context is key and king, I would say, probably in that way. People are very frustrated with us saying this so far, just because we keep saying this with Revelation, whether through Hebrew Bible. really, but it really is not just a eschatology or apocalypse or apocalyptic type reference. It is something whenever we approach any sort of text that is not from our modern perspective.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, so what is the context? And you're speaking of, I know there's multiple contexts at work here. There's like a Greco-Roman world in context in the first century. There's a context of the Hebrew Bible. Walk us through what's more of the context at work.
Exactly. Yeah. One of the things that I like, whenever I teach on the New Testament, one of the things that I try to emphasize over and over and over again is that any portion of the New Testament is always working with at least two really important layers or realms or aspects of context that are sort of in view. One is the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament and Jewish tradition. Because as we know, the authors of the New Testament, many of the people we meet on the pages of the New Testament, the folks who would have originally read the New Testament, these are not groups of Christians who are just somehow completely divorced from the Old Testament or Jewish tradition or God's covenant with the people of Israel. Rather, there's meaningful and significant continuity as well as discontinuity between the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. So much of what's going on in the New Testament is not just sort of a brand new storyline or sort of plan B because plan A with Israel didn't work out or something like that. But it's rather the entire story of God and God's covenant relationship with Israel coming to fruition, coming to fulfillment in and through the person of Jesus. And so at almost any point, if we want to understand the New Testament well, we need to recognize that these are people who have been shaped by Jewish tradition and the Jewish scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, and have encountered Jesus. And the New Testament is sort of the result of people putting those two things, people and communities putting those two things together. The witness of the Hebrew Scriptures plus encounter with Jesus equals New Testament. And so on almost any sort of question, exegetical or interpretive question we might have about the New Testament, one key aspect of context that can be helpful to keep in mind is how might my understanding of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament shape or inform my understanding of this text? And then the second, as you just mentioned, Trevor, the second sort of layer or aspect of context is that these texts were produced within and circulated within the Greco-Roman context, which is a way of talking about the ancient Mediterranean world that at the time was heavily influenced by Greek culture, but also was under the political control of the Roman Empire, hence Greco-Roman, both Greek and Roman influence within the ancient Mediterranean world during the first century. And so at almost any place in the New Testament, we want to think, is there anything about the Old Testament storyline that might illuminate what's happening here? And is there anything about Greco-Roman culture that might illuminate what's happening here? And this is a great, this passage is actually a great test case for sort of showing how this is the case. If we look back at the Old Testament, we're reading in this text about the Lord coming, the Lord sort of showing up. This is another example, even though it doesn't use the word apocalypse. It's another example of this idea of a sort of apocalyptic moment, this notion that Jesus would sort of return, would show up, would appear, would manifest his presence. And if we think about some of the imagery associated with it, it's really interesting that we have these loud noises, this archangel's call, the sound of a trumpet. We have this language of both descending and ascending. To any reader of the Hebrew Bible, as many of the early Christians would have been, to any reader of the Hebrew Bible, this imagery, this like picture that's being portrayed would call to mind various theophanies or appearances of God throughout the Old Testament. Perhaps most notably, the story of God appearing to Moses on Mount Sinai and the giving of the law in Exodus 19 through 24. And
the trumpets were blowing, they're calling people to come up to the mountain. Yep.
Exactly. You've got God sort of descending, Moses ascending and descending the mountain. You've got the trumpets, the earthquake, this kind of like imagery and phenomena associated with God sort of showing up and making himself known. And the emphasis there is on God's presence, and specifically it's on God's sort of movement toward humanity. And so when we see this sort of language of trumpets, of clouds, of God sort of showing up in this kind of context, naturally, at least one of the sort of frameworks that should be in our mind is this is yet one more example or one more portrayal of what it looks like when God shows up. Very often his presence is both made known, but also to some extent concealed by some kind of cloud. And very often there are these loud noises and trumpets and earthquakes and these various kinds of things that happen that sort of signal a manifestation of God's presence.
Well, and it really is a picture of, there's that tension, but you're speaking of like God's movement, his presence towards humanity, God's movement, and we would say the trajectory of the entire biblical story, which we'll get to. Stay tuned for that later. But the picture of God moving towards humans, and I think that's more accurate picture of what even the usage of certain terms in our text in 1 Thessalonians is. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. For example, when we're talking about verse 15, we're talking about of chapter 4, 1 Thessalonians, that we who are alive, we are left until the coming of the Lord, right? And the word coming in Greek, parousia, and it's the picture. It's an interesting picture because it's not just applied to the coming of Jesus. It's applied to when people like Paul would come to meet a companion or meet a friend, his movement, his presence towards someone. It's always a picture of one's presence meeting someone's actual presence. Yet, if we think about the picture of the rapture, when Jesus comes, you think about when Jesus comes a rapture, in any theological system around dispensation, the rapture, Jesus never actually comes to earth to actually meet people, right? He comes in the clouds or maybe the heavens. He comes kind of close, but he never actually comes all the way to meet you. And that's never the word parousia is ever used in the New Testament. It's an intimate picture of one fully coming to meet someone. And so I think we apply that, it relates to that picture of the Old Testament context. Now, so one sense there's the Old Testament context, but you also said the Greco-Roman context. So what's the Greco-Roman context or picture of this text?
Yeah, and this is probably the most significant and most important aspect of a right or a kind of responsible reading of this text that makes sense of it on its own terms, rather than reading our own ideas, say, of rapture and escape into it. Because as you've just said, Trevor, this notion of parousia, like we've talked about on the podcast before, there are all sorts of words and ideas in our New Testament that can seem to us like they're just inherently spiritual or theological ideas, like kingdom, or Jesus being Lord, or Jesus being Savior, one who establishes peace, and that kind of thing. But what we've seen in the podcast already in some of our conversations is that many of these terms would also be used in cultural and political spaces, in sort of mundane human life to sort of describe various aspects of reality and human experience, but also very specifically within the Roman political context. And so very frequently the New Testament authors are using this language that doesn't just have a kind of inherently spiritual meaning. It has cultural and political significance, and then is also used on that basis to talk about something that God does or something that God is. So Jesus is called Lord over and over in the New Testament, but also Caesar would have been called Lord or Kurios and Savior in the context of the Roman Empire. And so when we see this terminology, it has meaning and significance and connotations in multiple different kinds of frameworks and contexts. And this parousia idea is a classic example of that. As you just said, it would be a word that would be used to describe mundane human interactions, somebody coming to sort of meet somebody else. But it would also have almost a sort of, it would function also as almost a kind of technical term in the context of the political sphere. So when when a ruler, when a king or an emperor or perhaps even a general had maybe won a battle, had sort of gone off somewhere, had won some important battle and was coming back to the city, there would be fanfare, perhaps trumpets would be involved, and there would be a kind of
Russell Wilson coming back to Seattle after a victory or something.
Exactly, yeah.
That's what I'm imagining.
Totally. No, or even better, maybe imagine a kind of victory parade after a Super Bowl, right? And you actually have like the entourage thing. And what do people do? People go out to meet and become part of the entourage that then sort of ushers the victors back into the city. This is exactly the kind of picture that we're being invited into in 1 Thessalonians 4. it's this idea that the parousia of a king or an emperor is the coming of that the victorious ruler back into the city. And what would have happened in these ancient contexts, in these sort of walled cities with gates and things, is that the coming, the parousia of the king or the victor or the general would be announced, and then people would go out to meet them outside of the city in order to usher them back in. And so if the language of parousia and the imagery of trumpets and this sort of this idea of going out to meet the Lord or being sort of caught up to meet the Lord in the air, if this is drawing upon that kind of parousia imagery from the Greco-Roman context, which almost every New Testament scholar that I'm aware of thinks is exactly what's going on, then the movement is not people escaping this world to go off into some kind of disembodied heavenly existence. The picture is Jesus coming toward earth, Jesus showing up with this relational presence like you were talking about, moving toward this earth, and the people of God are being caught up to meet him in the same way that people would go out of the city to meet their king in order to become part of his entourage, in order to usher him into his kingdom, which is this redeemed or what will ultimately be this redeemed world.
So you're saying the implicit assumption is that you're not just going to be caught up in the air and stay there. The assumption is that you're inaugurating and coming back with the king to his kingdom. Yeah. The movement is not being caught up to just be in the clouds like some of our sort of pop culture ideas of like heavenly cloud existence. And it certainly isn't being caught up to meet the Lord in the air so everyone can just sort of get out of Dodge and go off to some other place. The movement is toward this world, this creation, which and this idea that we see throughout the New Testament of God's kingdom and God's presence coming toward this earth and sort of breaking into this present age. And the image of being caught up to meet the Lord is not about being raptured out of this world, but rather it has to do with sort of being caught up to meet the Lord and then to usher him into or to accompany him as he sort of comes toward this creation. Yeah, so it's a picture of the second coming of Jesus. I mean, that's what we're saying, right? Is that there's not multiple stages of Jesus' coming where it's like a rapture and then he comes at the very end of age, but thoroughly consistent in the New Testament. There's only two comings of Jesus. When Jesus came 2,000 years ago, when he died on the cross and resurrected again, and ascended to heaven, and then when he will come again to renew and restore the cosmos. And I think that's consistent as well. That's thoroughly consistent with how Paul uses parousia throughout the book of First and Second Thessalonians. I mean, I would encourage people just to read both books completely through. They're short letters and reading the letters, and just note every time he uses the word coming. I mean, if you read 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, you see he speaks of coming once again. He speaks of multiple times throughout the books. Chapter 3, he references in 1 Thessalonians 1 as well. And just pay attention to it. Like in chapter 2 of 2 Thessalonians, he's speaking of the end of the tribulation period when the Antichrist is destroyed, the man of lawlessness. And it's a very clear reference to the second coming of Jesus. Every other time in 1 and 2 Thessalonians, Paul uses this word to describe the second coming of Jesus. And so it would seem strange to me in chapter 4, all of a sudden, right in the middle, he decides to change what the word coming means, right? All of a sudden he decides to say, I used it everywhere else to refer to when Christ comes again, renew and restore the cosmos, destroy Satan, whatever else. Yet all of a sudden in the middle, I want to kind of change the language here just to really mess people up or something. And so we're seeing really the thoroughly consistent picture of the New Testament, a picture that we also see in another place in the New Testament, in another popular text, in the gospel accounts, in the gospel of Matthew, in Matthew chapter 24, what theologians refer to as the little apocalypse, because you read it, it feels like the world's falling apart in some ways, like we have read in apocalyptic genre in general. So, John, as we step into Matthew 24, another text that people use to justify the rapture, to speak of the things we've been talking about so far, just walk us through a bit, some of the basic picture of that text.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a text in Matthew 24, and there are parallel texts, or, in the Gospels, very often the same or roughly the same account is told from slightly different perspectives in what are called the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so in Matthew 24, Mark chapter 13, and Luke chapter 17, we have these parallel accounts in which Jesus engages in what is often understood as eschatological or apocalyptic sort of discourse, having to do with sort of the revelation of things related to the last days or end times, or however people want to sort of frame that. And yeah, the fact that there's a significant eschatological or sort of end times oriented component to these texts or these accounts, that's one feature that obviously causes people to think, oh, this rapture idea would fit well here because it seems to be a sort of end times idea. But especially the language and imagery that people gravitate toward, that again in this text seems on the face of it or on the surface to be a pretty obvious reference to this rapture idea, is this language of people sort of going about their business in a field or laying in bed or grinding a meal or something like that, and one being taken and one being left behind. This is where the language from the song we talked about in our last episode about, I wish we'd all been ready. That's where this language comes from. It's where the language even for the Left Behind franchise,
I think the opening verses, if I
from.
remember wating the 2014 version, is this verse.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Which
would make sense.
Which totally sets the movie up with this dark, ominous tone.
Totally. And so again, I think we want to acknowledge that if we're already working with this framework, if I have, for whatever reason, I've been taught or I've been led to believe that this rapture thing is a thing and is important, then of course it makes all the sense in the world that when I see this kind of thing happening in a text, my immediate assumption might be, oh yeah, well that must be that rapture thing that's happening there. And so there are even some Bibles, as we've said, that will even have a heading in Matthew 24 saying, oh, Jesus is predicting the rapture here. But it's important to recognize this is a producer of an English Bible who has put that heading in there, and it might not actually be the best sort of guide to what's actually going on in the text, partly because the word rapture or any word that would be translated that way doesn't appear here. But more importantly, because when we look closely at what Jesus is teaching, it becomes very clear that the logic of this text is the opposite of anything like a rapture. In the same way as we looked at 1 Thessalonians 4 and we looked at its context and we found that actually the logic of the text, the theology of the text, is the opposite of what a rapture idea would be. It has to do with Jesus coming toward his creation and ushering in his kingdom as victorious king. In the same way here, the very idea that people have that some people will be raptured, will be sort of taken away, and that's a good thing, and then other people will be left and sort of too bad for them. I wish we'd all been ready. That's actually the opposite of what the logic of Jesus' teaching here. And the crucial thing to recognize is just to pay close attention to the text and close attention to what Jesus is doing, because he's inviting his audience to think about the days of Noah as an analogy. He's saying, just as the days of Noah were, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, and they knew nothing until the flood came and swept them all away. So too will be the coming of the Son of Man. And then we have these images or these portrayals of like two people doing something and one being taken and one being left. The crucial thing to recognize is in the flood story, who are the people who experience a good outcome, right? Not the people who are swept away, not the people who are taken. It's the people who are left, who remain, Noah and his family within the ark, who are experiencing salvation. It's the people who are swept away who are experiencing God's judgment. And so what's fascinating about this is that people, in an attempt to support the rapture idea or in a sort of assumption that this must be what Jesus is talking about, people actually completely misread and sort of take in a kind of inverted way the logic of what Jesus is getting at. The whole idea is that the coming of the Son of Man will be sudden. And so it's important for people to be watchful, to keep awake, as some of these accounts talk about, and to maintain sort of obedient and faithful witness to Jesus, so that they won't be sort of surprised or caught off guard by Jesus coming. But the logic of it is that being taken away is actually the bad thing, the experience of judgment, whereas being left would be the positive thing.
And I think you're hitting on an important thread here, because a common question that I hear people ask or assume, especially with people who have a very firm kind of rapture dispensational system, is that picture of like, well, how can God leave the righteous or followers of Jesus when his wrath or his judgment is coming down, when the hammer's coming down? How could you expect him to leave us here for this? And it seems to, just Noah's a really good example of this, is it seems to be thoroughly consistent throughout the Old Testament story, throughout the story of the people of God, that it is never a picture of people being removed in the midst of judgment or wrath coming down. So whether that be Noah, I mean, you think of as Noah and his family were protected by the Lord while remaining in the world and during the flood. I think of Exodus. Exodus is a really important picture for this, because think of it when God is pouring his wrath and the plagues coming down in Exodus. Were the people of God all of a sudden snatched up, out of the plagues? No, they were living in Egypt when the plagues were coming down. Or another picture is, I think of in the book of Ezekiel chapter 9, if you read it, it's a very graphic chapter, but when the judgment and exile of the Babylonians are coming. I mean, the picture is that the people of God are in the midst of exile. God is calling people to follow him in the midst of that, and that he actually, if you read Ezekiel chapter 9, says that he can actually protect people in the midst of that. And so I think the consistent picture is not, if we're really drawing from the whole biblical story, is not that when judgment comes or wrath comes or however you want to describe that, is that people are all of a sudden jettisoned out of the world. But actually the people of God are in the midst of that. Now we could talk about, suffering, the tension of suffering and how God protects and what does it actually look like. I think there's a whole thing we could go down there. But the consistent picture, like you're hitting on, is that the people of God are there. And I think in Matthew 24, even as you read the flow of Matthew 24, you see that the coming of Jesus, the second coming of Christ, follows the tribulation. Like that's the flow, like we were reading in other texts as well in the New Testament. So Matthew 24, if we read verse 29, we're told this immediately. And right before this, we see the little apocalypse and crazy things and climactic things and a genre of apocalypse that we've talked about. But verse 29 of 24, he says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in the heaven the sign of the Son of Man, or the Son of Humanity. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Humanity coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they'll gather elect from the four winds. So notice God's gathering his people after the tribulation, right? It's a picture, and the trumpet, we'll come back to the trumpet a little bit later, but it's again a continual picture throughout the New Testament of the picture of after tribulation, the same word of tribulation that we looked at last week in our podcast as well. That's the thorough, consistent picture of there's two comings of Christ when he came 2,000 years ago, and the second coming in the very end when we gather as people. And so it seems to me, as even we're just studying and talking about this, that the picture of Matthew 24 is thoroughly consistent with what we've read throughout the Old Testament story, what we read throughout the entire New Testament of this picture of the second coming of Christ.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's helpful to recognize, I mean, so often what can end up happening when people read the Bible is we can develop through all kinds of different experiences, maybe accumulation of teaching over the years, also sort of pop culture, pop assumptions, these kinds of things. And we inevitably, when we try to read the Bible, we come to it with some kind of pre-existing theological framework. You could call that sort of baggage, like a kind of, like hermeneutical baggage, this idea that we don't come to the text as blank slates, but we have all kinds of assumptions, questions, expectations, what are sometimes called presuppositions, these frameworks. And that's an unavoidable reality. We can't just sort of completely blank out our minds and come to the text as a sort of blank slate. But what we can do is learn how to recognize and then critically evaluate our presuppositions. And I think that this is a great example of an important an aspect of our reading of Scripture where it's really important to do that, to try to identify where this assumption about a rapture idea comes from, to critically evaluate, well, to recognize, as we've talked about, just how recent of an idea this is, and that maybe it doesn't actually have a very long pedigree within church history or throughout church history. But also to recognize that it might not even be, well, it just, maybe I could put it more strongly than that. It simply isn't a great reading of these two biblical texts that we have focused attention on. And I think maybe one final thing to mention about these texts is that both 1 Thessalonians 4 and the text that we looked at in Matthew 24, it's important to recognize what the focus of these texts is and what it isn't. If my presupposition coming in is, oh, these texts are the ones that teach me about this rapture thing and when exactly it'll take place and how it all works and that kind of thing, I might sort of try to force the text to say something about those kinds of things. But if I patiently allow the text to reveal its own sort of focus, what I might find is that, in 1 Thessalonians 4, for example, Paul's intention doesn't seem to be some sort of complex chart of eschatological sort of time frames and a sequence of events and how the tribulation relates to the rapture and this and that. He has a deeply sort of pastoral tone that he adopts, and he's trying to bring sort of comfort and assurance to folks who have lost loved ones and are wondering, how is this all going to work when Jesus returns? And his emphasis isn't on sort of people escaping. His emphasis is on the Christian hope of bodily resurrection and the assurance we have that we will be with Christ and we will be part of what he's doing when he ushers in his kingdom and redeems and restores all of creation. So as we've talked about, it's an image of God's presence. It's an image of God's kingdom sort of breaking into this present age and believers being resurrected and restored in order to accompany Jesus in this as this sort of second coming is taking place. And likewise, in Matthew 24, the point is not, here's an eschatological timetable so that you can know exactly what's going to happen when, and this rapture thing is going to be part of it, and that kind of thing. The whole point of the little apocalypse in all three of its occurrences in the Gospels is this command to keep awake, to be watchful, to be obedient, faithful witnesses to who Jesus is and followers of him, because his second coming will be sudden, and one doesn't want to be sort of unaware of what's happening. The whole point is God's presence and redemptive purposes coming toward earth, and the importance of his people being faithful in the meantime.
That's so important. And let me end with this. Let me end with this episode of this picture, because this picture of his presence coming towards, not his presence snatching up or pulling out, I think really reframes the narrative of how we understand this, especially if we're coming from this kind of rapture dispensational perspective.
Yeah.
And I was reading my Bible reading plan. I'll finish with this text and we'll finish the episode because we're going to, is 1 John chapter 4. It's something I was actually reading my Bible reading plan this morning. 1 John chapter 4, verse 17. I think it speaks to this idea of the second coming of the Lord and this picture of his presence. We're told this in, again, 1 John chapter 4, starting in verse 16, we're told, so we've come to know and to believe the love that God has for us. God is love, and whoever abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him or her. By this his love is perfected with us, so that we may have confidence for the day of judgment, because as he is also are we in this world, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not been perfected in love. We love because he first loved us. And I just was so enamored and struck by this text when he was speaking of the picture of how you are not to have fear of the day of judgment. And I feel and I sense and when I talk to people that when someone holds a really firm, and this is not everyone, but a really firm kind of rapture perspective, fear is the first word I hear people speak of. Am I in or am I out? Am I one of the people who's going to be snatched up or not? Am I going to be left behind, whatever else? And the picture, the consistent picture in the New Testament is that God is love. And the picture is that perfect love casts out all fear. And John specifically speaking about the day of judgment here, not as a fearful, I should be scared of what's to come, which is unfortunately become many people's modern perspective of Revelation or eschatology or the end times. But it's actually a picture of God approaching, of God coming near, of God restoring and renewing. And so it's actually a picture that we have to sit with of God's presence and his invitation to be with us. And I think that really reframes the story and the narrative, and it casts out fear. That actually I'm actually not fearful of something in this picture of Matthew 24, 1 Thessalonians 4, but it does something inside of us and calls us to a place of faith, a place of excitement, a place of faithful witness and endurance, because we know we will see the Lord once again.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thanks for that. Well, we'll end this episode here. We've now spent 2 episodes where we didn't really talk very much about the book of Revelation, but hopefully it's become clear that we're trying to critically evaluate and to some extent deconstruct this popular idea of a rapture, which can so often factor into people's approaches to and understandings of the book of Revelation. Now that we've done that, in our next episode, we will look more closely at the book of Revelation, and we'll try to explore how not only does the idea of a rapture not show up in that book either, but actually the entire logic of the book of Revelation and the central theological message of it is counter to the very idea of kind of escapism and rapture theology. Thanks for listening to this episode. As usual, this episode was edited by Tim Muchira. It was produced by Dave Sproul, and we had music from Sherry Muchira.
Thank you for joining us, and should you want more information or to engage with us further, please go to mc4s.org for more.